There are stories buried deep in America's soil, stories that were never meant to be told. They whisper through the moss of old trees and echo in the broken cabins that once held cries of the enslaved. Some are tragedies of men and women crushed under the weight of cruelty, but others defy reason itself. Tonight we travel back to Mississippi, 1860, to a place where history and horror intertwine. Where something unexplainable happened to a boy born in chains, yet touched by something no one could understand. The kind of tale that made the old slave quarters go silent at night, the kind that left even the overseers trembling. This is not just a ghost story, it's a story that history tried to erase, because what happened on that plantation made no sense. It challenged faith, logic, and the very limits of human understanding. In the heart of Mississippi, the year was 1860, and the air itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of sin and silence. The earth was cracked and hot, soaked with years of sweat and blood, and the skies above seemed to watch with a still, merciless eye. The plantation stretched endlessly across the land, a cruel empire built on the backs of men, women, and children who were never meant to rest. The air smelled of cotton, iron, and something darker, a scent that came from years of suffering buried beneath the soil. The overseers carried their whips not as tools, but as symbols of control, snapping them through the humid air to remind every trembling soul of their place. The days bled together, and the nights brought no comfort, only the hollow sound of chains and distant cries that the wind carried into the trees. It was a time when God seemed to have turned his gaze away, and the devil walked freely among the fields, unseen but deeply felt. The land itself seemed alive with unease. The cypress trees loomed like mourners draped in moss, their roots crawling out of the earth like hands reaching for something lost. The swamps near the edges of the plantation were thick with fog that never lifted, and the older slaves whispered that spirits lingered there, trapped between worlds. No one dared to go near after dark. Lanterns flickered against the cabins at night, their dim glow revealing faces marked by exhaustion and fear, and yet it was in that same silence that whispers began to spread. There was talk of strange sounds, low hums coming from the fields long after work had ended, sounds that didn't belong to any man or animal. Some said the earth itself was crying, others said it was warning them. No one dared to speak too loud about it, even whispers could draw the overseer's wrath, and his punishment came without mercy. But unease had already taken root. Even the masters, those who thought themselves untouchable, began to feel it. They noticed the dogs grow restless at night, whining at the darkness as if something unseen moved through it. Horses refused to approach the cotton fields after sunset. The slaves began to pray louder before bed, clutching worn-out Bibles and muttering the same words again and again, desperate for protection from something they could not name. The nights grew longer, colder, and heavier with every passing week. It was as if the land knew what was coming, as if it had been waiting. Mississippi in those days was a kingdom of ghosts, long before death came for anyone. The cries of whipped men had soaked into the timber of the barns, the tears of mothers had seeped into the dirt floors of their shacks, and the laughter of children had long been replaced by silence. The plantation itself was a machine of cruelty, every part of it designed to crush the spirit and break the will. Yet, in that endless misery, something strange began to stir. The old ones spoke of balance, of how the world could only endure so much pain before it began to twist itself into something unnatural. They said that sometimes the land fought back, that sometimes a soul too pure or too broken became a vessel for something that refused to be explained. And in the summer of 1860, that balance broke. The heat that year was unbearable, the kind that made the air shimmer and the blood run slower. The crops suffered, and so did the people. Days were filled with screams, nights with uneasy silence. The river nearby ran lower than usual, revealing bones tangled in its roots. It was as if the world was showing its buried sins, daring anyone to look away. And yet life on the plantation continued, as it always did. Chains clinking, feet dragging, overseers shouting, and children growing up knowing nothing but fear. That was the setting, the stage where the story of the 11-year-old boy would begin. But even before his name was whispered, the land had already started to tremble with something unseen. The birds that once sang in the mornings fell silent. The wind changed direction and carried with it the sound of something faint, something that did not belong to this world. The slaves felt it first, a pressure in the chest, a pull in the bones, a heaviness that came not from work, but from the air itself. The overseers noticed it too, but refused to speak of it. Fear was not something they could admit to. Still, there were signs. Lanterns that refused to stay lit near the slave quarters. Footprints appearing in the mud long after everyone had gone to sleep. A single tree near the fields that never cast a shadow, no matter how bright the sun burned above it. The preacher who came on Sundays began to stutter during his sermons, losing his words as if something were choking the air from his throat. It was a time of strange omens and dark whispers, a time when even the bravest refused to walk alone at dusk. The plantation was not merely haunted by its past, it was alive with it. Every lash, every cry, every secret sin had carved itself into the land like a curse. The older women said the earth remembered. They said it could feel the pain of those who died upon it, that it drank their sorrow and waited for the day it would spill back out, and when it did, it would not come quietly. Something was moving beneath the surface, something that could not be reasoned with, something that would soon reveal itself through a boy no one truly saw until it was too late. The setting of unease was not just the backdrop of the story, it was the pulse beneath every heartbeat, the breath behind every whisper. It was Mississippi before the war, a place where the air was thick with both heat and history, where the cries of the enslaved met the silence of the indifferent, where every sunset bled red as if the sky itself were mourning. The people who lived there, masters, overseers, slaves, all shared the same land, but not the same fate. The powerful walked upon it with arrogance, the powerless knelt upon it with despair, but none understood that the land itself was watching. And in its gaze, reason held no power, for something older, darker, and far beyond human understanding was already awake beneath the soil. He was no different from the other children at first glance, small, thin, and quiet, with eyes too large for his face and skin marked by the sun's relentless touch. He moved like a shadow through the days, silent in the fields, never speaking unless spoken to, never raising his head when the overseer passed. His name was whispered only among the others, as if speaking it too loud would summon something best left sleeping. Born into bondage, he had never known freedom or kindness, but there was something about him that unsettled those who looked too long. Some said it was his eyes, dark and still, as if they saw things no child should see. Others said it was the way animals behaved around him. The dogs would growl, the horses would rear, and the crows would gather wherever he stood, watching him with tilted heads as if awaiting a command. From the moment he began to understand the world, strange things followed him. The first time it happened, he was no more than 7. A cruel overseer had raised his whip to strike him for slowing in the fields, but before the lash could fall, the man's hand froze mid-air. The whip slipped from his grasp, his fingers stiff as if turned to stone. He stumbled backward, eyes wide with confusion, and swore that for a moment the boy's shadow had stretched and reached toward him, twisting across the ground like something alive. No one dared speak of it, not even the overseer himself, who avoided the child from that day forward. But whispers spread, quiet at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. As the years passed, the strange occurrences grew harder to ignore. Lanterns flickered when he entered a room, flames bending toward him as if drawn by breath. Doors would open by themselves when he passed. The old women said his presence made the air feel thick, heavy, and electric, as if the world held its breath when he was near. He never laughed, never cried, never played with the other children. He simply existed, watching and waiting with those unreadable eyes. Sometimes, late at night, when the cabins were quiet and the fields glowed under a pale moon, he would hum to himself, a low, wordless tune that made even the bravest slave wake in cold sweat. No one could place the melody. It wasn't a hymn, nor was it a song from the old lands. It was something else, something that made the air tremble. The older slaves believed the boy carried a curse. They said his mother had died giving birth, her body twisted in agony, her eyes open wide as if she had seen something she could not name. Some whispered that she had been touched by something unholy before she died, that she had carried it into her womb, and the child had been born with it inside him. The preacher tried to pray over him once, to drive away whatever evil might be clinging to his soul. But when he placed his hand on the boy's head, he screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if burned. He never tried again. Others thought the boy was chosen, not cursed. They said he was a vessel, an instrument of the old spirits that watched from the swamps. They said his silence was not emptiness but listening, that he could hear what no one else could. Sometimes, when storms gathered over the fields, he would walk out into the rain and stand motionless, his head tilted toward the sky, lightning flashing above him, but never striking close. The thunder would roll, and for a moment it seemed to echo his hum, matching it note for note. The masters began to take notice as well. The plantation owner's wife, a pale woman who fancied herself godly, claimed to see the boy standing outside her window one night, though he was supposed to be locked in his quarters. She said his eyes glowed faintly in the dark, not with the reflection of the lantern, but with a light of their own. When she screamed, he vanished. By morning, she was feverish, muttering about the devil's child. The overseer searched for the boy and found him asleep in his cabin, his small hands clutching a torn piece of her white nightdress. No one could explain how it got there. The white men on the plantation feared him, but could not bring themselves to destroy him. Something in their hearts warned them that to harm the boy would invite something worse. A few of them tried. One man attempted to drown him in the trough behind the barn. But the next morning, that man was found dead, his body bloated and pale, water dripping from his mouth though there was no rain, no nearby river, and no explanation. The boy was found sitting near the barn, dry, staring at the man's corpse with a stillness that made even the strongest overseer take a step back. The slaves avoided him now, too. They refused to eat beside him or share his tools. The children ran when they saw him coming. Yet, when someone fell ill or was injured, they whispered his name in their prayers, just in case, because for all their fear, they knew that whatever followed him was powerful. They had seen enough suffering to know that not all evil came from man, and not all power was meant to be understood. The seasons turned, and still the strange boy moved through life as if untouched by time. He grew taller, leaner, but his face remained ageless, unchanging. He seemed neither child nor man, only a quiet witness to everything around him. At night, the older ones heard him humming again, the same haunting melody, and they said the sound crawled under their skin, following them into dreams filled with water, fire, and eyes staring from the dark. And as the tension grew across the plantation, as the fields grew restless and the masters more cruel, so too did the unease that surrounded him. Every time a whip cracked, the wind howled. Every time someone cried out, the earth seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The boy's silence became louder than words, his presence heavier than chains. The slaves began to believe he was not one of them anymore, that whatever had taken root inside him was waiting for something, a signal, a moment, a night when reason would finally collapse, and whatever haunted him would reveal its true face. The masters of the plantation had always believed themselves to be untouchable, men of iron will and divine favor, born to command and destined to rule over the lives of those they owned. Their word was law, their cruelty a daily ritual, and their faith rested not in God, but in the belief that fear was stronger than mercy. Yet something about that boy began to stir a quiet dread in them, a fear they could neither name nor control. It started small, like a sickness of the mind, an unease that crept into their bones when his shadow passed, or when his humming drifted through the night air. They mocked it at first, laughed it off as superstition whispered by ignorant slaves, but the laughter didn't last. Strange things began to happen around them, small and sharp reminders that they were not the masters of everything. The plantation owner, a man who prided himself on control, began waking in the night, drenched in sweat, swearing he heard footsteps outside his window, soft, deliberate, and steady. When he lit his candle and looked out, he saw nothing but darkness, yet he could not shake the image of two eyes staring back at him, low to the ground, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, the footprints of a barefoot child were found pressed deep into the dirt beneath the window. The overseers said it was a prank, but none dared to say whose prints they were. Another man, a cruel overseer named Tully, claimed he saw the boy standing in the fields long after midnight, his small figure still among the rows of cotton as the fog rolled thick and heavy. When Tully shouted his name, the boy did not move. He began to walk toward him, and with every step the fog seemed to thicken until he could barely see his own hand. He stumbled, swore, and when the mist cleared for just a moment, the boy was gone. Only his hat remained, lying perfectly still in the dirt, though the wind was strong enough to bend the trees. By morning, Tully's hair had turned streaks of grey. He refused to go into the fields again after sundown. The fear grew in quiet corners. The women in the big house whispered of objects moving by themselves, silver spoons clattering in drawers, curtains swaying though there was no breeze. The master's wife began to wake with bruises on her arms shaped like small hands. The preacher, who had once called the slaves beasts, began to drink himself into silence after a Sunday service where the boy had simply looked at him, unblinking, from the back of the room. It was as though the plantation itself was unraveling, every soul touched by an invisible hand that twisted reality just enough to drive them mad. Animals began to behave strangely. The dogs that had once barked with fury at the slaves now cowered near the cabins, whining whenever the boy walked past. Chickens refused to lay eggs, and horses screamed in the stables at night, eyes rolling white with terror. Once, the plantation owner's prize stallion was found dead at dawn, its neck twisted at an impossible angle, its eyes wide open, its mouth foaming with blood. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle, just a strange symbol carved into the ground near its body, a spiraling mark that no one recognized. The masters, who had spent their lives believing in order and domination, found themselves living in chaos. They began to argue among themselves, accusing one another of witchcraft, of madness, of weakness. The slaves kept their heads low, but even they could feel the change. The fields grew darker at dusk, the air heavier, and the cries of the whip were no longer the loudest sound at night. Something else was moving in the shadows, something that even pain could not silence. One night, the plantation owner ordered the boy to be brought to the big house. He wanted to look him in the eye, to see for himself what manner of creature he was. The boy was dragged before him, his wrists bound, his expression empty. The master demanded he speak, demanded he confess whatever sin he carried, demanded he explain the things that were happening. The boy said nothing, only stared. The silence stretched until the master's anger turned to unease. He struck the boy across the face, but the child didn't flinch. A moment later, every candle in the room went out at once, leaving only darkness. The men shouted, fumbling for light, and when they finally managed to relight the candles, the boy was still standing there, blood on his lip, eyes glimmering with something that was not fear. The master dismissed him that night, but his hand trembled as he poured himself a drink. After that, no one dared speak to the boy directly. Orders were given through others, and even the overseers avoided looking at him for too long. The power dynamic that had once ruled the plantation began to shift, not through rebellion or violence, but through something unseen. The masters started to act like prisoners in their own home, locking their doors, refusing to walk the grounds after sunset. Their authority meant nothing in the face of something they could not name. There were reports that the plantation owner's youngest daughter began to talk to someone in her room at night. When asked who it was, she said it was the quiet boy from the cabins. The problem was, the boy had been locked in the smokehouse for punishment 2 nights in a row. When they checked on him, he was sitting in the dark, eyes open, staring at the wall. The girl stopped speaking altogether a week later. The men who once ruled with violence now ruled by fear. Their cruelty turned inward, their confidence replaced by paranoia. They started carrying crosses around their necks, though they had never been men of faith. The preacher tried to bless the land with holy water, but the ground seemed to absorb it instantly, leaving the soil dark and wet, as if it had swallowed blood. The master's health began to fail, his skin turning pale, his eyes hollow. He dreamed of the boy every night, standing at the edge of his bed, whispering words he could never remember upon waking. His wife wept constantly, and the slaves prayed louder than ever before, though even their prayers seemed to vanish into the air unanswered. By then, no one questioned whether the boy was human or not. The only question left was what he wanted, and what it would take to make him stop. But there was no reasoning with the silence, no bargaining with the eyes that seemed to see into the soul, no escaping the slow, consuming dread that had settled over the land like a shroud. The story of that plantation was not only one of mystery, but of the unbearable weight of history itself, where every horror that man inflicted upon another had left an echo that refused to die. Slavery was not simply a condition of chains. It was a system that reshaped the soul, crushing every trace of humanity until only obedience remained. The land was soaked with that kind of torment. It was alive with it. Every inch of it carried memory, footsteps worn into the dirt by generations of the enslaved, sweat and tears absorbed into the ground, and the faintest whispers of prayers that had never reached heaven. The suffering was so deep and so constant that it seemed to pull the natural world into its grief, twisting the air, the animals, even the light itself. The story of the boy was born from that same darkness, a reflection of something too vast and too painful to be understood by human reason. In the fields where he worked, the boy's silence was louder than any cry. The older ones who labored beside him said he carried something ancient in his stillness, as if he had inherited not one soul but thousands. When he lifted his head, there was a strange intelligence in his eyes, the kind that didn't belong to a child. The overseers said he was slow, touched in the mind, but the slaves knew better. They said he was listening, to the ground, to the wind, to the voices that spoke from the past. They said the land talked to him and he could hear its pain. And in that listening, in that unnatural awareness, the boy became a vessel for all that the plantation had buried. Each lash that cracked across a back, each mother that cried out for her stolen child, each man who fell dead in the field, became part of a weight that no one could carry. But the boy did. He seemed to absorb it, to draw it into himself until it became something alive inside him. Sometimes when the nights were silent, he would sit near the fire and hum softly, and those nearby swore they could hear faint voices within his tune, voices of the dead, of those long gone, mingling with his breath. The slaves said it was grief turned into sound. The overseers said it was madness. But the masters, those who ruled by cruelty and believed themselves beyond consequence, could not bear the sound. It made them restless, reminded them of something they didn't want to face. The horror of the boy's presence was not in what he did, but in what he revealed. Through him, the plantation seemed to show its true nature. The cotton fields, once a symbol of wealth, began to rot in patches without reason. The trees leaned unnaturally, their branches twisting toward the slave quarters as though drawn to the sorrow there. Even the sky seemed different, sunsets bleeding into a deeper red, mornings cloaked in fog so thick it choked the breath. Those who lived there began to see shapes in the mist, fleeting shadows that moved where no one walked. They heard crying in the wind, and when they turned to listen, it was gone. The old preacher who came once a month began to lose his voice. He said that when he tried to preach about mercy and deliverance, the words would stick in his throat. He could only speak when he talked of punishment and wrath, and even then his voice trembled as if he knew those words were not his own. The slaves began to fear the services instead of finding hope in them. They said the boy sat at the edge of the crowd, eyes fixed on the preacher, and each time he did, the candles flickered low. No one dared look at him directly, but everyone felt his gaze, heavy and knowing. The horror grew not from sudden terror, but from the slow unraveling of everything that had once seemed unshakable. The masters lost their control, the overseers lost their certainty, and even the slaves lost the comfort of believing that their pain ended with death. It was as if the barrier between the living and the dead had begun to thin, and the boy was the tear in that veil. Through him, the past demanded to be seen. The screams of the whipped, the moans of the dying, the silent despair of those who were never counted. All of it came back, not as ghosts that could be seen, but as a presence that could be felt in the bones. When storms came, they came without warning. The sky would turn black, and thunder would roll so close it shook the cabins. The rain came down hard, flooding the fields, washing away crops, and yet, through it all, the boy would walk into the open, staring up into the downpour as if waiting for something. Lightning would strike near him, but never on him. The others watched in silence, afraid to move. They said the sky was trying to speak to him, that the thunder was calling his name. When the storm passed, the air would be unnaturally still, and everyone could feel the chill of something unseen lingering behind. Even the strongest men on the plantation began to break. They dreamed of faces they had never known, of eyes watching them from beneath the ground. One man swore that he woke to find muddy handprints across his chest, small as a child's. Another said he saw the boy standing by the river at dawn, but when he approached, the figure dissolved into mist. The plantation had become a place where reality bent under the weight of the past, where time itself seemed to loop and tangle. The boy was at the center of it all, silent and unmoving, like an anchor holding the pain of generations. Some believed he was the punishment sent by the dead. Others whispered that he was their savior, a spirit sent to remind the living of what they had done. But no one could deny that his presence forced the truth into the open, that the evil of slavery was not only in the chains and the whip, but in the silence that followed it, the silence that let such cruelty exist without question. He was the embodiment of that silence, a living reminder of everything the masters had tried to bury beneath their wealth and power. The air around him seemed to bend, and the world itself seemed to shift in his wake. Children cried without knowing why when he passed. Fires burned lower near him, and water turned cold. The very sound of his breath carried a weight that pressed against the heart. Those who saw him said he looked like he was always listening, not to the living, but to something deeper, something that moved beneath the surface of the world, something ancient and endless that had been awakened by the endless suffering of men. The boy did not belong to the world as others did. He was part of something far older and far darker, something that did not forgive and could never forget. The night it happened, the air was thick with the smell of rain and iron, the kind of night when the sky seemed too heavy to hold itself up. A stillness lay over the plantation, deep and unnatural, the kind of silence that comes before a storm or before something worse. The slaves had finished their work early that day, hurried back to their quarters without speaking. Even the overseers were uneasy, pacing the porches with rifles in hand, their eyes shifting toward the fields that swayed under the weight of windless air. The master stayed inside, the doors barred, the curtains drawn. He had not slept in days. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. The boy was nowhere to be found. He'd been missing since the morning, and though no one dared to speak his name aloud, every mind on the plantation was haunted by the same thought. The old women whispered prayers in the corners of their cabins, rocking back and forth, clutching scraps of wood carved into crosses. The children cried without reason. The men sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the floor, afraid to look out toward the fields. The wind had died completely, and yet the trees moved as if something brushed against them unseen. The first sound came from the barn, a low groan that wasn't quite human. The dogs began to bark, but not like dogs. Their voices broke into sharp, frantic howls, then silence. The overseers shouted for the men to check the fields, but no one moved. One of them, younger and braver than the rest, lit a lantern and stepped into the night. He didn't make it far. Before he reached the barn, the lantern shattered in his hand, the flame snuffed out as if choked by invisible fingers. He screamed once, short and sharp, and then nothing. The other men called out to him, but there was no answer. When they found his body later, his eyes were open and his mouth was filled with dirt. Then came the humming, low and slow, carrying through the air like something ancient. It wasn't the sound of a child anymore. It was deeper, layered, as if more than one voice was singing through the same mouth. It came from the direction of the fields. The slaves pressed themselves against the walls of their cabins, whispering prayers through trembling lips. The masters stood frozen in their house, clutching pistols that suddenly felt useless. The humming grew louder until it was everywhere, inside the walls, under the ground, in their bones. Lightning split the sky, a flash that turned night into blinding white for only a heartbeat. And in that moment, those who looked toward the fields swore they saw him, the boy standing among the cotton, his face lifted toward the storm. The plants around him were moving, bending, twisting as though pulled by unseen hands. His clothes clung to his thin frame, soaked in rain, but he did not shiver. His eyes reflected the lightning, empty yet shining, and for a moment it seemed as if the storm itself was looking through him. The wind came then, violent and cold, sweeping across the fields like a living thing. The barn doors burst open, animals screamed, and the air filled with the sound of cracking wood and shattering glass. The slaves huddled together, and even those who had never believed in spirits began to pray. The overseers fired their guns into the darkness, but the sound of the shots was swallowed by the roar of wind. Every flash of lightning showed glimpses of the boy, standing still while the world around him tore itself apart. The ground shook beneath their feet, the trees bent low, and the sky howled as if the heavens themselves had split open. When the storm passed, the plantation was in ruins. The fields were flattened, the barn destroyed, and the main house stood broken, its windows shattered and doors torn from their hinges. The air smelled of smoke and salt, though there had been no fire and no sea for miles. The slaves crept out from their cabins trembling, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The masters were gone. Some said they had fled into the swamp, others that they had been taken by the storm itself. Their bodies were never found, and the boy, he was nowhere. Some claimed to have seen him walking toward the river before dawn, his feet bare, his body untouched by mud. They said he was humming softly, the same haunting tune that had filled the air before the storm began. Others said he vanished into thin air, that one moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving only a trail of footprints that led nowhere. The older slaves said the land had taken him back, that he had come from the soil and returned to it. In the days that followed, the plantation stood empty. The crops withered, the animals scattered, and the once bustling fields fell silent. The few who passed by said the place felt wrong, the kind of wrong that could not be seen but could be felt deep in the gut. Grass refused to grow in certain spots, and when the wind blew, it carried with it a faint sound, like a child's hum carried from somewhere far away. Travelers avoided the area, and even the bravest refused to go near after dark. Those who remembered the boy spoke of him in hushed tones. Some said he had been an angel sent to avenge the suffering of the enslaved, that his silence had been the voice of the earth itself crying out for justice. Others believed he was something older, something that had no mercy or faith, something that rose from pain to punish those who fed on it. The truth was that no one could explain what had happened. The destruction had no logic, no pattern, no sense. Nature had turned on itself, and in the middle of it all stood a child who had never known love, whose eyes held the reflection of both heaven and hell. Years passed, and the story became a whisper among the old, told only in the darkest hours of night when the rain beat against the roof and the wind moaned through the trees. They said if you listened closely, you could still hear that humming, faint and distant, drifting across the fields where nothing grew anymore. The elders warned the young never to forget, never to mock the suffering that built the world around them, because the earth never forgets, and sometimes it remembers in ways that reason cannot explain.